Good morning, Dr. Newman back here, and in this lecture we're going to be talking about one of my favorite poets, John Milton. Milton is, of course, one of the biggies, one of the centerpieces of this course, and I think of classical English literature. John Milton was an enormously brilliant man. He was born in 1608. And lived until 1674. We're going to talk a little bit about his education and his personal life, his political career, and just a little bit about his ideas before we get into discussing one of his great works, Paradise Lost, which is an epic poem about the fall of humanity in the Garden of Eden and the war in heaven. Nothing but the very biggest theme for old Milton. Milton was middle class, and this meant and still means something rather more specific in England than it does in the U.S. In the U.S., everyone is middle class, from whether you work in a factory or you're a corporate lawyer with a golf club membership, you'll still call yourself middle class. In Britain, it's really only the latter who can, of the two, that can call themselves middle class. People there will much more readily identify themselves as being working class. And middle class means really, in a lot of ways, in Britain, and meant in John Milton's day as well, what we would call upper middle class. And part of the reason is because Britain has like an actual titled upper class. Being a member of the upper class in Britain means that you can identify your family tree to somebody who belongs to the peerage, somebody who's a member of the gentry or the aristocracy. So Milton's father was fairly well-to-do, and he attended Cambridge. And at Cambridge, he shone as a student. He wrote poetry in Latin, Italian, and English, and prepared for a career in the clergy. But this was before the Revolution, before the Civil War, and he was really disaffected with the clergy of the Church of England and didn't see a spiritual or intellectual home for him there. And he abandoned clergy to prepare for a career as a poet. And he spent years in extensive study in his father's country home. If you look at his sonnets, there's for example, a sonnet to my father, and there's another sonnet, when I consider how my life is spent. And in these, he sort of grapples with his vocation as a poet and with the obligation that he owed to his father for supporting his ambitions. While he was basically isolating himself in study, he read classical and modern works on religion, science, philosophy, history, politics, and literature. He became proficient in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, French, Spanish, and Italian, and even familiarized himself with Old English and Dutch. Somebody once said that Milton may be the last person who we can say read everything. Now, of course, in the generation after Milton, we get the sort of third wave of the explosion of print media in the 18th century. And the volume of writing in the Enlightenment becomes way too much for somebody to have read everything. But in Milton's time, it's still it's an exaggeration, but it's a little bit feasible. In his youth, he traveled in Europe. He was a radical Protestant himself, and when he went to Italy, he stayed with a group called the Waldensians, who were a kind of a radical Protestant group who had actually been around since the Middle Ages, when they were kind of underground heretics. He married 3 times. He had 2 daughters and a son, and his marriages ended with him being widowed. But his daughters lived with him late into his life, and one of them worked as his secretary, especially because he ended up going blind. He wrote most of Paradise Lost completely blind, which is kind of an amazing feat. One of the interesting things about Milton's life is that he was one of the revolutionaries in the English Civil War. He championed the parliamentarian cause and that of the Puritans and Oliver Cromwell. He wrote a series of pamphlets advocating radical political topics. He advocated, for example, divorce, arguing that God created the world by division, light from darkness, land from water, and therefore division was good. It's a very rhetorical kind of thing. He also argued in a certain way for freedom of the press, and we're gonna circle back to that. He argued for sovereignty coming from the people, what you might call populism, and he also argued defending the execution of King Charles I. And he's under Cromwell, under the Commonwealth. He served as the secretary for foreign languages, and composing official statements defending the Commonwealth. Kind of a press secretary type position, except that's a little anachronistic. Kind of a diplomatic position as well. He was the one who communicated the government's policies and statements to the rest of Europe, right? He would translate what the government of England said, the revolutionary government of England said, for the other states of Europe. But during this period, at the beginning of the Commonwealth, he lost his vision. They believe he had macular degeneration, and he was completely blind by 1651, and sort of retreated to the background, but he continued to write. After the 1660 restoration, one of the deals by which Charles I was brought back to England and given back the throne was that a lot of the people who had been involved in government under the Commonwealth and the Protectorate would be pardoned, except for anybody who had taken part in the execution of King Charles I. Now, Milton wasn't directly involved in that execution, but he did write a defense of it. And so his was on the list of people to be arrested when Charles II returned. At this point, Milton has basically been a shut-in, a blind old poet for close to 2 decades. And so a younger poet named John Dryden intervenes on behalf of Milton and says, look, we don't execute this old poet. That's not a very civilized thing to do. He's harmless. Leave him alone. And so he was fined and released and returned to his country home, where he would go on to compose Paradise Lost. I just want to focus in on one aspect of his career as a pamphleteer and a political writer. And this is something that as Americans you should know about, we should know about. And this is a treatise he wrote called the Areopagitica. And this is one of the first defenses of the idea of freedom of speech that we have. Before this, there was no real idea that anybody should be able to write what they want. But he believed that. Well, he writes here, as good almost a man as kill a good book. That is, like, killing a good book is like killing a human being. Who kills a man kills a reasonable creature, God's image. But he who destroys a good book kills reason itself. He also wrote, and we're going to come back to this in Paradise Lost, especially when we talk about Book 9 and Adam and Eve, so keep a pin in this, but he writes, I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary. In other words, if you believe you have the good, and you know what the good is, and that you believe in the right of what you're doing and what you believe, then you should be able to not be worried about having your ideas go and confront those of others, right? And I guess that you should be confident in your ideas and in your truth if you've thought it through. That it shouldn't be fugitive, running away, or cloistered, like closed in your own monastery of the like-minded. Remember, the word cloistered would have especially negative value for a Protestant because they rejected monasticism. They rejected the whole idea of being a monk or a nun. That was not part of Protestant spirituality, especially in this period. One of the interesting things, a couple things about the Areopagitica, is that it's not altogether committed to free speech, because he does say in it that I'm only talking about Protestants here and the different types of Protestants. Obviously, we're not going to let Catholics publish their garbage in England. And again, I'm paraphrasing here. I don't believe Catholic thought is garbage. I'm just saying what he would have thought. And what he's basically saying in the Areopagitica is that within this particular set of broadly defined set of beliefs, we can allow free debate and free speech. But if you go outside that, then no, you should definitely be censored. And one of the interesting things about why this was written is that Charles II had tried to exercise control over the press in England during his reign. He had tried to control what got printed, by whom, what theological or political ideas were allowed to be printed. And of course, his enemies in the English Civil War, the parliamentarians, the Puritans, they all said, no, that's terrible. He's squashing out all these good ideas, and he's a tyrant and stuff. And of course, when the parliamentarians and the Puritans came to power, and then people started printing things against them, they were like, oh, we can't have that. So they started to try to control the press. And Milton was, if nothing else, he was a very principled man. He said, no, that's garbage. We can't be hypocrites. If we're going to say that Charles II can't control the press, then we shouldn't do it either. We should. And this is why he argues that in the Areopagitica that if everybody is allowed to speak their mind, then people will, and all ideas are presented, except for the really garbage ones, of course, then people will see the truth and naturally gravitate it, because the truth will always be stronger than lies. And there's a kind of, I don't know, do you think that's optimistic? I think about it in the light of our own day and our own attitudes towards free speech, and there's still a sense in which there's still debates over, to what degree do we allow free speech? To what degree are certain things garbage that we're not going to let in? There are those who criticize people who want to keep, like, I don't know, Nazi ideas, for example, and then call them snowflakes or wanting safe spaces or something, and they're saying no, that's not part of civilized discourse. I don't know. I'm not making an argument here. I'm just pointing out some of the ways that these arguments continue in sometimes similar terms. In any case, Milton ends up sort of retiring from public life because of his blindness. He can't work at the rate, and he gets a pension, and he's allowed to focus on writing his poetry, and he follows the kind of, very self-consciously, the poetic career as it's conceived by people who study the classics. So like Virgil, he will first write pastoral lyrics about shepherds having debating philosophy and having love affairs and stuff like that. But of course he uses the pastoral to talk about pastoral issues in the sense of the Christian church and what makes a good pastor in the Christian church. And this is the poem Lycidas, which is a great and rich poem. And then he'll go on to write longer poems of various kinds, and then he'll move on to his great epic. And I think I'm going to make that a separate linked video. So watch for the next video coming up, and that will be on Paradise Lost. We'll introduce it, we'll talk about the features of epic, and then we'll look at the proem to book 1. So hang in there.